So there's two different categories of the way that you can work with us, or customers can work with us. So the first fall into what we call turnkey integrations. So that first scenario is where we have connectors that are already built for BigCommerce, WooCommerce, Shopify, you name it. There's so many platforms out there that we have connected to already. And then, as Bob mentioned, we custom configure those connectors to the needs of the client, because we find that 10 WooCommerce implementations could all be completely different, because everybody uses Sage 100 differently, everybody uses their website differently. So there are certainly common trends, but we will tailor it to their needs. It's not just a drop it in and that's what you get. Another way that we can configure that is flat file. We can also do CSV flat file imports and exports if that's the level of integration support that the client's platform needs. Then we've got the do-it-yourself options. And with those do-it-yourself options, the first one we've done for quite some time, and that's where we install our IN-SYNCH module, but we set up the developer for the platform will set up the database, and he connects to that SQL database, and all we're doing is publishing data to that SQL database, and then it's up to them what they do with that data. And that's been very good up to a point, but now we've been getting a lot of requests for an API, and this is not a Sage API, it's our connector API. But what it does is it allows us to give the client and the developers standardized endpoints that they can use to push and pull the data, so that they don't have to configure it out of that SQL database, but they can use an API endpoint. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And Bob will go over that in more detail.
Just something that Kim mentioned earlier. So what we're doing is we're helping these developers by giving additional methods, additional access to our connector API. So like Kim said before, either we do it all where we're actually setting up services that reach out to the end user's website, pushing and pulling, whether it's a CRM, 3PL, whatever it may be, we're doing all of the work. Or we're giving them a database access, and then they have to sort of almost learn how Sage does it. And a lot of times they don't want to work with having a database, et cetera. And so we get asked frequently, doesn't Sage have an API? And so what we did was we came up with these, it started out, basic, and then we just started expanding on it as users, started taking it and running with it. These endpoints that basically give access to our data service on the connector. It's not, we didn't redo Sage e-business web services or create an API that allows direct access to Sage 100. So, we're not doing that. But what we are doing is giving these developers some alternative means to be able to access and do their own sort of integration using API methodology versus getting right to a SQL database. I'll go into some of those examples and stuff shortly. So what we do is we'll set up, depending on if the user, and I've got a perfect example of a phone call that Kim and I were on yesterday morning. We'll set up some endpoints based on what they want to do, if they want to send orders or whatever. And we still I don't want to use the word protect, but shield the developer from having to deal with or work with all of the Sage 100 rules and business objects. They're just pushing data to these endpoints that have data contracts with the data service that are at the table level, right? So a sales order, the contract is a sales order number is 7 characters. It may have a division in a customer. The address fields need to be the specific lengths. It needs to have lines. Other than that, it's what we deem as the rules for the contract. It does not matter from the Sage 100 aspect. A customer does not need to be entered. We still do that now when we import orders where we create new customers. The same thing with these endpoints. So the developer doesn't need to be now suddenly a Sage 100 business object expert. We give the Swagger documentation as that for each person who needs it. That contains all of the information. If anybody's ever used that documentation.
Thank you.
That documentation gets built dynamically based on the API endpoint, so it's very thorough. And the solution is very scalable, which I'll get into some of the a bit technical here in a little bit of what we can do and what we allow access to. And again, because we're still doing it the way that we like to do the integrations, where we tightly integrate but we loosely couple, right? So we intentionally disconnect the data service from Sage 100, so they pass data back and forth via our system, but they're not directly connected. So even though there's these endpoints that are running, that are being used, Sage 100 could be shut down Friday night for an upgrade, and then turn back on Monday morning. Everything still works. Obviously, the orders don't go into Sage if it's not running, but the website's not going to be shut down. The endpoints are not going to not work and give errors to the developer saying that they don't exist. And so our just like when we do integrations, we're constantly getting requests out of left field asking for, we do website integration, but we also need you to do general ledger, journal entries or AP invoices or what have you. We have a standard set that are active right now that basically you could push a sales order. Actually, you can push an invoice, it's not on the list. Sales order invoice entry. You could post customers, and that's customers, new customers, create customers, change customers. You can pull customers back. You can get order history. You can get invoice history, get open receivables. You can get item availability, and you can get item pricing. So what we do, for instance, is if we're going to do item pricing, for instance, and it's going to be on one of my examples, we could allow someone to say, hit the endpoint and give me the price if Bob buys 10 widgets. And it'll go perform the customer Bob buys 10 widgets, and it'll go perform the exact Sage 100 pricing calculation, come back and run through all the hierarchies and the whole 9 yards of how Sage does it, and then give back the information of what price level, what price record it used, what the different prices are. So the developer wouldn't just say, give me the price, and then we would respond back with $8.33. They get $8.33 plus all of the information that came across for that specific level of pricing. And with the getting customers and getting orders and invoice history, we made some of the search filters so that you could get order history if you wanted for customer C100. You can also do a get of the orders, order history that I have not gotten yet. So for instance, if they have 1 million records in order history, you could say that the developer could say, give me the orders from today. And then 5 minutes later, give me the orders that I haven't gotten yet. And that doesn't return another 1 million records. That returns 4 more, because 4 more have been entered, and we're keeping track of what they've received, and that with some cooperation of what they're getting. That we're keeping our records up to date, that we did give those. So the next time they ask, we don't return 10,000 orders again. We return 4 orders since they last asked. And then so I'll just get into some of the use cases of like why someone would want to go this route, right? Because the first 2 options we've been doing all along, and do exactly what they're supposed to do. But we do get different requests, and I'll go through some scenarios. Now, Kim and I were on a call yesterday where we had a user. I'm just basically going to describe the way the call went. We had a user, we quoted a WooCommerce integration where we were going to do the integration to WooCommerce, and then the technical or the developer, consultant on the Sage side said that they were just having problems with getting the necessary website and resources together. Couldn't get that going, so he was going to create an e-commerce site from whatever custom site he was going to use, whatever he was going to do. And so then we said, well, obviously then, the way this was proposed was we would reach out to the website and interact with the website's backend API, push inventory quantities up, pull orders back, push tracking numbers up, etc. So he said what he would do is now he would have to go develop all of that. And then once he was done, if we were going to continue doing the same solution, consecutively, right? So it wouldn't be like concurrent. It's now he's got to do his thing, then we pick up, start doing our thing, and then test it on his end. So now we're talking, a big delay, and he was actually anxious also to get it fast. We just said, well, if you're going to develop a system anyway, and you're going to do some API development on your end, why don't we give you an API that you could send orders to? And then all you have to do is just use your own custom site and do whatever it is that you want to do, and we'll just give you an endpoint that you could talk to and push orders to all day long. So instantly that was a slam dunk. We're going to be sending that over, and not only does that give them a better solution, it also saves a ton of time, because now once they say go, our endpoint is going to be there ready, waiting. He just does his development, which he would have had to do anyway, but basically it's to get the thing moving and going now versus just to get his endpoint up for us to then begin. So it was just a neat example right before this webinar. Anyway, so a couple of different scenarios. We had one client. So the first one I'm going to talk about, what they had was they had an e-business manager site and an old Sage system, and they were upgrading Sage. They weren't going to be able to use e-business anymore. They already had a website that was already talking to e-business manager and some of the things in Sage. And so it was just natural just to drop our system in and allow them to do everything that they were doing before, have much more control over it, and give them access to much more data. So now, they can do all the things that I was mentioning earlier on, with what they're doing. And they've got complete flexibility over it. We've built in functionality where they can just send user-defined fields at will. If suddenly this end user adds 5 more user-defined fields to Sage, and they all are something from the website, it just works. The website just starts sending them to the endpoint. We built in dynamically checking to see and pulling them apart and setting them. So that was a slam dunk for them. And we also maintain a development and a production environment. So they have a system where they have a production system that's live. They have a development system which they're always doing new beta things in and getting ready, and then they just move it over to live. So it's kind of a neat scenario. Second client was someone who had a WordPress site. WordPress is what WooCommerce is built on, but WooCommerce is an add-on basically to a WordPress site. WordPress is the system, but it's not the shopping cart. WooCommerce is the shopping cart. Drop it on top of a WordPress site. They created a WordPress site, and their developer had created some forms so that the end user when the customers would go to the site, it was a B2B only. You could only get in if you had your login. And then it was a very rudimentary way to get orders in. It was very quick. They could go in, open up the form, say, I'm customer C100. I want 10 widgets, 10 boxes, 10 of these, 10 of those, 20 of these, I'm done, and submit the form. And then what the user was going to do was they were going to try to use SQL database or try to create something on their end for us to talk to. Again, we just set up the endpoint. They just went in and can pull the data together, fired it off to the endpoint, and they're just running and creating orders in Sage now. The next one, an example this was an interesting one. What they wanted to do was they had a Magento integration, or have a Magento integration. And what they're using is flat files for orders going in, customers coming out, inventory items coming out, and inventory quantities coming out. And they wanted to maintain that because they had this big elaborate network of moving data around and everything. So they just didn't want to go revamp all that. So they had us do we're basically doing a periodic monitoring of customers' items and quantities. And then we drop them to an XML file format every 10 minutes, I think. And then we use an automated FTP to send that over to the website. And then we're also pulling information back in and creating sales orders. What they also wanted to do was they wanted a way to be able to say when a customer is on the site that they could go to Sage and say, perform the Sage pricing algorithm and return back. And so what we did was we stood up our pricing endpoint, and that's what they're doing. So they've got this sort of mishmash of integration methodologies where they've got this, the old flat file and a new API endpoint to return Sage pricing. So that one was a unique one. And again, we're just trying to make it so they've got alternative ways to do their, get this job done. And then the last one is a good example because this is where we have a client who's using all of those endpoints I mentioned earlier, plus a bunch more that we're doing. And what they're going to do is they have developers doing Salesforce integration, and they're doing all sorts of things in Salesforce. We don't want to be try to say, let's now figure out how to integrate to Salesforce with all these different functionalities. We now have to go learn all of that. We don't want to be a jack of all trades and a master of none. We want to be the integrator. So what we did was we set up all these different endpoints for them, including the custom ones, to allow the Salesforce developers to hook into and do all of the integration via the endpoints. So now the Salesforce people can do all of their things and be the experts on Salesforce and just send the data and pull the data as needed and then do their Salesforce stuff with what they've got.